writer, social commentator, activist. His popular debut book, Chavs, The Demonisation of Working Class, has helped put class politics back onto the agenda. He's written for newspapers and magazines and regularly appears on TV and radio, including recent Question Time on BBC One. And I have to say, not just because of his achievement I'm jealous of him, he makes me look a lot old, so that's how I usually like it. But anyways, Owen Jones.
Massive pleasure to be back here in Newcastle. And some great speeches, and I think that puts it in perspective what we're up against. And I just wanted to start actually by talking about what I think we are up against, because I think in opposition David Cameron was woefully underestimated. He was portrayed as a shallow salesman, all style, no substance, poncing about the Arctic with huskies, hugging hoodies. I mean, he had that shtick about broken Britain, didn't he? Criminality, lawlessness, people who didn't play by the rules, but it turns out he's just talking about his dinner party set. But the fact is, he isn't actually this cuddly, liberal, one-nation Tory. He's leading one of the most right-wing governments that this country has seen since World War II. And what it's done, and it's done it cleverly, and sometimes you've got to take a step back and look at the genius of your opponents, is it's turned a crisis of the market, a crisis of the banks, and it's turned it into a crisis of public spending. It's perpetuated this myth we have a deficit because of public spending, and I have to say it's a bit cheap from the Tories, because they actually backed Labour's spending plans pound for pound until the end of 2008. And we've got to be clear about why we have a deficit, because this myth, this is the biggest lie of modern politics. The reason we have a deficit was because New Labour failed to regulate the banks properly. Now let's be honest, the Tories were calling for even less regulation at the time. And we had a financial crisis which caused our tax revenues to collapse and welfare spending to go up as people lost their jobs. But what they've done, I mean, this has become the biggest opportunity imaginable for the Conservatives. What should have been the death knell of everything they stood for, a crisis of neoliberal economics, became that opportunity. I'll just quote you actually, Rahm Emanuel. He used to be Barack Obama's chief of staff, and at the beginning of the crisis he said you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that is an opportunity to do things you could not do before. Now that sums up for me succinctly exactly what this government and other governments right across Europe are doing. Introducing policies that in normal times they'd never be able to get away with, but at a time of crisis passing it off as inevitable and necessary. So we're seeing it right across the board. Beginning by George Osborne, we're all in this together, a statement which has veered from the ludicrous to the offensive ever since it was first said. And whilst for the majority it is a serious economic crisis, the average Briton, most of you in this room, are now going through the biggest squeeze in living standards. Not since your parents, not since your grandparents, maybe not even since your great-grandparents. It's the biggest squeeze in living standards that's been seen in this country since the 1920s. There's a report the other week which showed in 2016 the average living standards of people in this country will be lower than it was at the turn of the century. Now, what we've seen, even though we've got this huge economic crisis for the majority, it remains boom time for the people at the top. Each year, people might see it, the Sunday Times does a rich list of the top 1,000 richest people in Britain. Their wealth went up by a fifth last year. The year before that, it went up by 30%. It's the biggest jump ever recorded in the history of the rich list. It's the same with boardroom pay. The top 100 companies, they went up by nearly 50% last year. The year before that, it went up by 55%. This idea there's no money left in this country, we're bankrupt, is a lie. There's loads of money sloshing around to the bank accounts of the people at the top. Now you make this point, and often there's this idea, if you stand up for the bottom 70%, you're portrayed as a class warrior. If you stand up for the top 1% and you're a moderate. And that's exactly what we're seeing, for example, with a 50p tax. They'll hike VAT up, a tax which hits people on low and middle income. And yet when the top 1% have a 50% tax put on them, they squeal, don't they? They organise massive campaigns, letters, they threaten to flee the country. Now that, if you like, they're brilliant themselves, the people at the top at waging class war. Any attack, even the most limited, on their privilege and their power, even at a time when their wealth continues to soar, when corporation tax is being slashed. You have to ask, what more do these people want? And yet they still bemoan. They talk about this rising level of anti-business rhetoric when most people are being absolutely hammered. But also what this government's done in the worst possible way is play the politics of divide and rule. Now again, the One Nation Tories, and what they've done since they've come to power, is they've tried to turn the working poor against the unemployed over benefits, the able-bodied against disabled people, again over benefits, and private sector workers against public sector workers on pensions. They promised this big, generous society, but they're trying to build a resentful and divided, ugly society. Now what we have to do then, we have to be absolutely clear about this. We need to develop ourselves a coherent alternative, because at the moment they're making the runnings because we haven't organised properly around the coherent alternative. So I know Lindsey got the ball rolling, and I think maybe we should talk about this tonight in the discussion. But I'll just throw some ideas around. Firstly, tax justice, again, as Lindsey referred to. The £25 billion is lost through tax avoidance alone by the wealthy each year. We hear a lot about benefit fraud in this country. It does happen. It's worth £1.2 billion a year, far less. £25 billion. People like Sir Philip Green, who was appointed by this government as an advisor on public sector waste. Now, his company is registered under his wife's name in Monaco. I have to say, these people are taking the piss, frankly. So we need to call for tax justice, as well as not only clamping down on tax avoidance as well as tax evasion, which is worth even more, but to actually make the people at the top pay their fair share. Now we talk about welfare and welfare so-called reform that's going on at the moment. Now actually we can be clear, we can talk about welfare reform. For them, the reason we have this big welfare budget is because of lazy scroungers sitting around with taxpayer-funded widescreen TVs for putting their reflections on Jeremy Kyle. That's the caricature you see in the press. But the reality is, the reason of the benefits bill, if you like, is firstly a lack of jobs. As that famous left-wing propaganda organ, the Daily Telegraph, pointed out the other week, there are now 22 unemployed people chasing every vacancy in this country. Now the official unemployment rate is 2.7 million, you can forget that, because as the TUC pointed out, to include other people who are economically inactive but not included in that figure, as well as people in part-time work who can't get full-time work, the number of people who can't get, who are looking for secure full-time work in this country and can't get it, is 6 million. Now that is partly why we have this benefits bill, is this lack of work to go around. The other point though is a housing crisis. Now, because successive governments failed to build council housing, and because we got rid on a grassroots level, and they changed that. So if people want to shift their unions, I mean, my own dad actually was a senior shop steward for Unison, and I know people are frustrated about Unison, but it only comes, I think, from pressure from below, from organising. Otherwise, of course, the leaders, I mean, what's the incentive, if you like, unless they're dragged by pressure from below? And this idea, yeah, I mean, you know, this myth of, for example, people being unemployed because it's their own fault, they're feckless and all the rest of it. I mean, what Thatcherism did, and Thatcher said this in 1979, she said there's no such thing as primary poverty in this country. Okay, there are people who don't know how to budget, don't know how to spend their earnings, but she said that is a behavioural personality defect. That was at the heart of Thatcherism. We don't have social problems in this country, we've got individual failings. It was the same as well with get on your bike at the peak of mass unemployment. Now, because Labour stopped making the case about those issues, that allowed, and that has meant attitudes have shifted. And at a time of mass unemployment, 22 people chasing every job in this country, the public image of the unemployed that we see is the scrounger. Now, we have to take on those myths, because that enables the Tories to attack people as they are doing the unemployed in this country. And